St. Charles and World War II. Walking through the permanent exhibits at the St. Charles History Museum, visitors will come upon a list of over 1,000 names of men and women from St. Charles who served in World War II. This list was compiled in 2003 with the help of the St. Charles American Legion and VFW posts. It is included in a photo album with photos of 250 of the servicemen and women from St. Charles. The photos were taken by World War I veteran and St. Charles businessman Carl Gartner. Gartner served in the Army's 33rd Division in France during World War I, and later in the 33rd Army Band touring French cities and playing in concerts and parades. After the war, Gartner returned home to St. Charles and his family's business, Gartner Bakery. His service didn't stop with the end of World War I. Carl was a charter member of the St. Charles American Legion Post 342. He served for 26 years with the Selective Service on the draft board. And during World War II, in addition to photographing many of the young servicemen and women in their uniforms, he helped organize the effort to send St. Charles Chronicle newspapers to all St. Charles boys fighting overseas. Gartner was just one of many St. Charles residents who proudly displayed their patriotism throughout the difficult war years. While the men of St. Charles were joining the Army, Navy, Marines, and Army Air Forces, many women were joining the WACs, WAVES, SPARS, and Marine Corps Women's Reserves. Residents who were not serving in a branch of the military found ways to contribute at home by purchasing war bonds, rationing, planting victory gardens, and joining the workforce. Due to labor and transportation shortages during World War II, it was often difficult to deliver fresh fruits and vegetables to markets across the country. As a result, the government began encouraging people to plant victory gardens to grow some of their own produce. St. Charles resident and philanthropist Lester Norris served as the Illinois Food Director and chairman of the board of the National Victory Garden Institute during World War II. Norris spoke at several conferences during the war, highlighting the importance of planting victory gardens, as well as the benefits people would enjoy by participating in the Victory Garden program. Some of the benefits mentioned included the gardeners feeling a sense of accomplishment in eating something they themselves had grown, fostering a renewed sense of neighborliness in larger cities, and an introduction to a healthful and interesting new hobby that could be continued for years to come. Throughout the war, the Victory Garden program was a popular and successful initiative. In the years after the war, victory gardens went by the wayside as people grew busier and found new hobbies to occupy their time. In the past few years, however, community gardens have started to make a comeback. Some folks are likening this increased interest in gardening and the growing number of community gardens to the victory gardens of the 1940s. Across the nation during World War II, factories switched their production to items needed for the war effort. St. Charles Manufacturing, Hawley Products, and Operadio were several of the factories in St. Charles that saw either an increase in production or change in items being produced during World War II. Prior to the war, St. Charles Manufacturing produced St. Charles Kitchens, custom-built steel kitchen cabinets. They also manufactured cabinets for schools, hospitals, and other industrial uses. When the war came and production shifted, St. Charles Manufacturing began producing ammunition components for both the Army and Navy, aircraft parts, and sheet metal components for infantry landing craft, tank landing craft, and landcraft support. St. Charles Manufacturing was a 3-time winner of the Army-Navy E-Production Award for excellence in war production. St. Charles Manufacturing was not the only St. Charles business to receive the Army-Navy E Award. Hawley Products also received the award on multiple occasions. Hawley produced molded fiberglass items, and during the war, they were responsible for providing the military with speaker components, headsets and microphones, battery cases for communication equipment, aircraft engine components, detonator packings, as well as combat liners for steel helmets and tropical helmets known as pith helmets. Operadio Manufacturing, whose company slogan was Symbol of Electronic Excellence since 1922, produced radios and radio components before World War II. During wartime production, they developed communication equipment for both the Army and Navy, including tank interphones, shipboard communication systems, bomber interphones, and the electronic portion of the machine gun trainer. In these factories, like those across the United States, more and more women were being employed as the men went off to fight in the war. Women who weren't taking jobs in factories or joining one of the branches of service found other ways to support the war effort on the home front. And once again, for many, this meant involvement in the Red Cross. St. Charles resident Delora Norris always had an interest in nursing and giving back to her community. While Delora's husband Lester was busy with the Victory Gardens, she was busy serving as the chairman of the Red Cross Civilian Defense Unit in St. Charles. This was a great fit for Mrs. Norris. She was already a Red Cross volunteer and nurse's aide at the hospital bearing her name, Delnor. While World War II was a difficult time, the people of St. Charles pulled together and did all they could to help each other and support the war effort, both at home and overseas. St. Charles and the Korean War. Looking through the research files at the St. Charles Heritage Center and paging through issues of the St. Charles Chronicle from the early 1950s, one will find there is little information included about the Korean War or the impact of the war on the residents of St. Charles. Articles were printed in the St. Charles Chronicle about the draft board opening new offices, and there were mentions of local boys leaving jobs to rejoin the military. The In the Armed Forces column did reappear in 1951 with notes about men and women from St. Charles who were in the armed forces. And during these years, there were stories about both the American Legion and the VFW posts in town. The St. Charles VFW Post 5036 was first established in December of 1945. In 1951, the VFW broke ground for their new building on 3rd Street between State and Cedar. During the Korean War, the VFW and American Legion actively participated in Memorial Day and Armistice Day parades and celebrations, as well as fundraising events like the March of Dimes and selling poppies on Poppy Days. Like they had after World War II, these groups were here to help and support the veterans when they returned home after the end of the Korean War. St. Charles and the Vietnam War. St. Charles residents living in town during the late 60s and the early 70s will no doubt remember the story of Robert White, the last POW returned to the United States as part of the Operation Homecoming program. White grew up in St. Charles and graduated from St. Charles High School in 1958. He volunteered for the draft in November of 1960 and spent 2 years assigned to the Fitzsimmons General Hospital in Denver, Colorado. White re-enlisted in the Army in August of 1965, and after completing his basic training and going through the Aircraft Maintenance Officer course, he was assigned to Vietnam for a year between January of 1967 and January of 1968. He would return to Vietnam in October of 1969 after further training back in the States. On November 15, 1969, Robert White and a naval officer were flying an OV-1 Mohawk when their aircraft was hit by enemy fire. The men ejected safely but were captured. White was held as a prisoner of war until his release on April 1, 1973. For almost the entire duration of his captivity, White was the only American in the camp. For over a year and a half, he was confined to a small cage. He became sick and suffered from severe malnutrition. White credited his survival on his attitude of determination, the friendly and cheerful attitude he projected towards his captors, and his faith. When White returned home to St. Charles on May 5th, the day was declared Bob White Day. There was a celebratory parade down Main Street, a reception at the high school, and a dinner at Pheasant Run. Bob retired from the Army as a major and moved with his wife to Colorado. Men and women from St. Charles have served our country for over 150 years, both at home and on the front, and they continue to do so today. The residents of our community are proud of and grateful for their service and the service of all men and women in the armed forces.